Welcome to the channel, folks. My name's Shane. If you're a camera nerd and you like audio equipment, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell. I review a lot of products here in the studio and out in the field, and I show you a lot of test samples and shots shot in different parts of Australia and around the world. So we're going to start probably with my oldest camera first. I'll talk about how I used it, and then we'll move on to some of the other cameras in this collection. Now, what I'm going to do is also timestamp everything down in the description below, so you can skip ahead back and forth if you so choose. To kick things off, let's talk about the GH5M2 and where this really shines. So if you're a content creator or filmmaker and you want a small compact camera that has all the codecs under the sun, great 4K 60 10-bit, as well as 50 frames per second if you're in the PAL region, a full-size HDMI port. It never overheats. All the good stuff that you loved about the GH5, the GH5M2 takes it to the next level. Now, this is the one I actually snapped the selfie screen off right after I bought it, but I like this camera so much, I ended up actually getting it fixed, which was great. Now, being that I own a GH6, the 4K quality out of this is every bit as good as the GH6, but the GH6 has a lot of higher end codecs and it also has that crazy CF Express Type B card slot. I much prefer this just as a run and gun tool. It's smaller. I can also use a battery grip with it as well. This was the main camera I took with us when we went to Hawaii, and it was a really great choice, except for in a couple of different situations, and I'll explain a little bit about that coming up. Earlier in the year, I purchased a Sigma 24-70 full frame lens for the Sony E-mount. I was like, this lens sucks. It's so big. It's great, but it's so big. And being that there's so many baggage restrictions when you travel overseas, the 12 to 35mm f2.8 paired with the GH5M2 gave me awesome video quality, awesome battery life, and it's small and compact. So if you're looking for great image quality in most shooting conditions, where you get a small lens on a body that gives you all of the features under the sun and great flexibility, then this combination is fantastic. There's only two major downsides when it comes to the GH5M2. The first being low light performance. Paired with the f2.8, it does get noisy fairly quickly. If I'm using an f1.7 lens like this 25mm, the low light performance is pretty solid. In most shooting conditions, you can get away with an f1.7 lens. This is my favorite travel combination when I need something smaller, lighter, that will still do an excellent job. Micro Four Thirds and the lens lineup don't give you as much background blur as the full frame cameras, but I tell you what, after owning a lot of full frame cameras, I actually enjoy thinking a little bit more about framing my shot rather than just blurring out the background to no end. So Micro Four Thirds for me is still a great system. I actually have a few of them I'm going to talk about in this video, but the GH5M2 might be one of the best content creator tools on the market. Now, the autofocus on the GH5M2 is so much better than the original GH5 in both face detection and also in one area and one area plus modes. They've taken the autofocus to the next level, or as far as they can, with contrast-based DFD technology. It's still not the best, but if you're using a lens like this 12 to 35 or the 10 to 25mm Panasonic Leica lens, the autofocus is very usable, and if you're behind the camera, you can make this work most of the time. Up next, I'm going to talk about the Panasonic S5. I own 4 of these. I've got them in my other studio as a multi-camera setup. Now, there's a couple of trade-offs with this camera, but overall, this is a really great camera for the money. I think the biggest trade-off between this and the GH5M2 is the IBIS system. It's just nowhere near as good. And this also gives you 10-bit recording limitations, whereas the GH5M2 gives you none. You can record all day with that camera without any additional crops or anything, and it works beautifully. But overall, for the 8-bit modes, you can let it run all day, and that's how I usually use it. The only other small trade-off with this camera is the micro HDMI ports, and being that I use them with external monitors all of the time, one of them's already starting to come loose, so that's a bit of a trade-off there. I hope they rectify this on a future model of this camera. But overall, the image quality out of this is every bit as good as the Sony FX3 in most modes. Obviously, this doesn't do 4K 100 or 120 frames per second, but just in the standard resolutions like 4K 24, 25, or 30p, it will be every bit as good as the Sony FX3. Now, like the GH5M2 and like the GH6, this still has contrast detection autofocus, but I don't use autofocus in the studio. I'm not using autofocus now. And the great thing about Panasonic cameras, I turn them off, turn them back on, and it remembers my autofocus point. It's pretty cool like that, so I don't need to rely on autofocus. And I've had autofocus fail me quite a number of times on one of my more expensive cameras, which we'll get to in just a moment as well, so stay tuned for that. But overall, this is a really great powerhouse of a camera if you're a content creator looking for the full frame look, or if you're shooting in low light. It's also a great photography camera. A lot of people don't realize just how good this is for photos. A lot of people dismiss it based on its autofocus being DFD, but the video quality and photographic quality out of this, I like it a lot, and it's my favorite hybrid camera of them all when it comes to getting great results at an affordable price. So it's a really special camera in that regard for me, which is why I have 4 of them. It's crazy. Up next is the Sony FX3, the old hype train camera of YouTube before the FX30 came out, and then all the Sony fanboys were pushing that on everybody. But this is a really cool camera if you're the type of person who likes just to hit record and have the camera do everything. It does have some features where you can kind of dig in there and learn how to grade S-Log3, but overall I find this camera extremely boring to use, but I love the end result. There's only one thing about it I don't like. That's the IBIS. The in-body image stabilization for Sony sucks. It's really not very good. I took this overseas on a shoot I did in Florida with the Sony A7S III, and I had to run so much through Catalyst Browse to make it usable, which took up so much more time. So I hope Sony end up getting a better image stabilization in their cameras, and then this would be an absolute no-brainer to take on a trip where I don't have to worry about running everything through post-production. Let's talk about this XLR top handle. It's too big to fit into a camera bag, but it's great if you're doing any type of handheld work, or if you just want to plug a professional shotgun microphone in. It sounds beautiful, so it's got that going for it as well. We get a full-size HDMI port, but I haven't even gotten to the best thing about this camera. The 4K 120 looks beautiful. It looks absolutely stunning. You pair that with a fast lens, you can shoot indoors in low light and get spectacular slow motion. The low light performance is great. The autofocus is great. The color science, at least in my opinion, is great. In terms of just getting a beautiful straight out of camera image, this is stunning for video work. It absolutely is. And the 4K 60 doesn't crop in or do anything weird like that. So there's still a great camera. No DCI 4K, which is kind of weird being that it's a cinema camera, and no filmmaker tools. What are Sony thinking? Let us know your thoughts on this camera. Like I said, it's kind of boring to use, but the end result is awesome. I'm a bit more of a hands-on kind of guy, so I appreciate its simplicity, but I don't enjoy using it as much as other cameras. Up next is the Sony A7S III. This is basically the same camera as the FX3, minus the form factor, but with the addition of the best electronic viewfinder that I've ever used personally. I think there's some that are higher resolution than this, but it looks so much better than every other camera here in the house. Another reason why I want to get this instead of the A7 IV, I couldn't live with all the crops of the A7 IV for run and gun style stuff. I don't want to have to be changing out lenses, and I also wanted that spectacular 4K at 120 frames per second. It's so good that I thought it's probably worth it. So what did I do? I traded up a couple of GH5S cameras and some micro four thirds lenses, got this and changed over the difference from the A7 IV, and this is how I got the A7S III. Now, this isn't a cheap camera by any stretch of the imagination, but I love using this. I think form factor wise, I prefer it over the FX3. When I'm shooting here in the studio, makes no difference, but when I've got this in my hand, I love the grip, I love the feel of this. The joystick on the back to me makes more sense than having it on the top. You've really got to try to use the FX3 in a very different way. And if you're rigging it out, that will be the camera to go for. But just as a handheld run and gun camera, this looks a lot less conspicuous as well. I really like the fact it's just all black and it's got a full-size HDMI port, matching dual card slots, all the good stuff. So when I travel overseas, and we took this to Florida with the FX3, I was able to get a sense of redundancy. So this is a great camera. If you got one of these, it should be the only camera you need as your A or B cam. It's spectacular. Let's do a quick recap. So I went from micro four thirds, I got into the Panasonic full frame, then I got into the Sony system, and to get part of that Sony system, I traded in some micro four thirds cameras, only to rebuy some micro four thirds cameras. One of the things I learned about traveling overseas with really expensive camera gear, it's just no fun. You're paranoid about your camera bag, you're paranoid about where your camera bag's at when you're not there, you just worry about leaving it in the car, all that kind of stuff. So one of the things I ended up doing when I got back, I thought I need a much lighter, smaller, more portable travel rig, and I already had it. So I did what many would consider to be kind of crazy, but I ended up buying a couple of GH5S cameras again. I like to use the GH5S in a multi-camera setup. The reason why is they're small and light. I can throw a few of these in the bag and they weigh so much less than the full frame counterparts. This is much lighter than the original GH5. It's probably as light as the G85. It's the same physical size as a GH5, but it doesn't have the IBIS system in there, and it has a different sensor. You get a wider field of view, slightly more background blur, a dual gain ISO sensor that handles low light performance extremely well. When I first had this camera, I don't think I fully understood how to get the most out of it. And this is what's changed for me over the last year or so. I love the hands-on experience when it comes to getting the end result. I don't want the camera to do everything and make the decisions. I really like getting in there and making sure I nail focus. I have everything set up the way that I want it. I think about the framing, and not having all of that insane background blur makes me think a little bit differently about what I'm doing. And when the results look good, I feel so much more proud of myself using a micro four thirds camera than I do full frame. It's a kind of weird thing to say, but it's how I feel about that whole hands-on experience. The GH5S might be the most underrated micro four thirds camera ever. It's got great low light performance, excellent image quality. You can fully customize it, including the picture profiles, dual SD card slots, exceptional battery life, it's light, and you can get all of these little tiny lenses for it that give you great results. I love shooting with this outdoors. I took it outside today and I matched footage from this with the Sony A7S III, and it was almost indistinguishable. And if I can get some samples on screen, I'll show you. But the GH5S is an absolute beast. If you can still find one of these, pick one up. I'll link one below. And now over to the Panasonic GH6. This is a camera I've got a bit of a love-hate relationship with. I love the image quality, and that should be the most important thing, right? But it also comes down to the overall user experience for me. Like with the GH5S and the FX3, they've got a pleasant user experience. One's completely different to the other, but they're fun to use. This is kind of fun to use, but not as fun, and I don't love the fact we get a CF Express Type B card slot and an SD card slot. Kind of wish they had made a second one of these just with matching SD card slots, pull down the resolution and put phase detection in there. That would have been amazing. It would have been my #1 camera, and I would have bought 3 more of these. This is a great camera for a number of different reasons. The first being the IBIS. The IBIS is unbelievable on this. It's by far the best out of all the cameras. It's better than my old Olympus camera. So if you've ever used an Olympus, the IBIS system in here is spectacular. And if you pair it with that 12 to 35mm f2.8 lens or the 12 to 60 f2.8 to f4 lens, you're going to get awesome stabilization. So the IBIS in here is class leading in my experience. We get a full-size HDMI port as well, which is awesome. One of the best user experience things with the GH6 is this flippy tilty screen. Now, when you see a lot of people do this, they don't realize it can do this. It goes up further. So yeah, it's a 2-part tilt. A lot of people don't seem to realize that. This camera is loaded with codecs, resolutions. It can do full HD up to 300 frames per second, and it has open gate recording. The open gate on here looks amazing. I'm getting excited talking about the GH6 because it is loaded with a lot of stuff, but it's a lot of stuff that I won't use on a daily basis. For me, the GH5S suits my needs a lot better when I'm sitting here in the studio. But as a run and gun tool, man, this is so much fun because of that IBIS. But I just don't love the fact I can't get a sense of redundancy by using the same media type within the camera. Another addition to this since I first got it is now you can record out to an SSD drive. So that may be a reason enough to buy it if you want to shoot ProRes. But there's a great camera. There's nothing to dislike about it. Heavily reminds me of the form factor of the FX3, from the grip to the red record button on the top and on the front. There's a lot of similarities there, but this is packed with so many more features than any of the Sony cameras. And lastly, I took this overseas alongside the FX3 and the A7S III in a multi-camera setup using an A10 Mini, and it looked every bit as good, minus the difference in the background blur. But pair this with something like the 25mm f1.7 or any better lens than that, and you're going to get excellent results. So I love the small lenses for micro four thirds, and this is an absolute powerhouse of a camera. I know what you're thinking, there can't be any more cameras, right? There's more cameras. I got problems. But I got nothing on Marcus Picks. If you don't know him, go check out his YouTube channel. I'll link it down below. So in my hands here, I have the GoPro Hero 10 Black. This was the most used camera on all of the trips overseas for anything that we did outdoors, and I'll explain why. The stabilization from a GoPro when you're outdoors on a bright sunny day is second to none. It absolutely wipes the floor with any of the cameras that I've got here at the house, including the GH6. The GH6 looks spectacular for a mirrorless camera, but the GoPros are just unbelievable when you're talking about stabilized footage. It just looks so good. You don't have to do anything. You just walk with it. No matter which way you hold it, it's going to look impressive and very, very stable. Not only does the GoPro Hero 10 have great color science, in my opinion, but it also allows you to get different resolutions all the way up to, I think, 5.7K or something like that as well. So it's got super high resolution, pretty high and well above 4K. But the thing with this is if you're shooting those modes, the battery life just gets zapped right down. So I stick to the 4K 50 or 60 modes, depending on where I am. And I also love shooting in the 4K 100 or 120 frames per second modes. The slow motion out of this is so good. I love the fact I can just put a GoPro in my pocket, pull it out and get exceptional image quality. Now, the biggest trade-off with a GoPro is the fact that they can overheat. And secondly, the indoor low light capabilities are non-existent. So you can't really use these indoors under normal lighting conditions. They're just completely unusable. But outdoors, the GoPros are unreal. I also love mounting them on the dashboard or facing outside to get a little bit of what's going on in any location we're at. And then I generally import that footage and mix it into my final products for some of the shows I put together. So the GoPro footage is far better than I think people realize. And while they bring one out every year, I don't really see a huge benefit to just upgrading every year. I've got the 8, 9, and 10. And any of them will do the job if you just want to shoot 4K 60. There's some new features and fancy stuff in some of them, but the battery life gets incrementally worse every year until they release new batteries to compensate for that. But basically the 8, 9, and 10, I love using these cameras and they're my favorite travel camera, bar none. Thanks for watching, folks. My name's Shane. I hope this has given you some clarity on a little bit of the use case for each of these cameras. I think all cameras, irrespective of their sensor size and brand name that's plastered on the front, has a purpose that it can fulfill that other cameras can't, irrespective of the price. The GH5S has so many more features than some of the newer cameras. Sony FX3 has its benefits when it comes to its autofocus and low light capability. The Panasonic S5 is a bit of an all-rounder, but with some limitations when it comes to its recording time, but the price is right. So you can get great results out of all of these depending on the situation you're shooting in. Doing a multi-camera setup, for example, would be completely different to, say, doing a run and gun shoot behind the camera outside in the park. So just keep that in mind. There's the right tool for the job. Don't get too disheartened if the sensor size you shoot with is smaller than something else that you're looking for. You can make it work. Thanks for watching. My name's Shane. Leave a thumbs up if you can, and I'll catch you soon. See ya.